list. Let's move on to section 2, architecture of the document. And this section, we've just divided up into 2 parts, which is 1, just the basic organization of the document, the preamble, the articles, and the amendments. And then the second thing, and this is the big part of this section, are the 3 key principles, right? Separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. So just really quickly, let's do a quick sketch of the document. We know that it begins with the preamble, just an introductory opening sentence, right? Very short, mostly symbolic. Then we have 7 articles, which are divided up into sections and clauses. And then we have 27 amendments, which are also divided up into sections and clauses. Let's start with the preamble. The preamble is basically just a brief statement of purpose, right? We talked about how it's largely symbolic, right? It speaks in these general terms, right? It doesn't actually give us a whole lot of meat to work with, right? Like the rest of the Constitution, right? These are just kind of broad ideas, right? In order to form a more perfect union, right? To establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, right? It's very flowery, it's very pretty. It gets you excited to read the kind of nitty-gritty parts of the Constitution, but by itself, it doesn't really do a whole lot for you, right? So let's get into the meat of the Constitution, the 7 articles. Article 1, of course, creates Congress. It talks about Congress, right? It says what Congress's duties are. It talks about the limits on Congress, right? So this Article 1 is all about the legislative branch, right? Article 2 talks about the presidency. The focus is the executive branch. Article 3, the judiciary, that is the federal court system. Article 4 talks about state powers. Article 5 tells you how to amend the Constitution. Article 6 is kind of a random assortment of stuff. It's still, there's a lot of important stuff in Article 6, but you don't need to memorize the details of it. And Article 7 talks about how the ratification process happened back in 1787, 88, 89, right? How the Constitution was ratified by the states. I want you all to learn these, right? This was on your first quiz. Many of you at that time refused to learn these. I think it's important that you know roughly what's contained in each article because there is no table of contents in the Constitution. There is no index. If you want to be able to look something up, you need to be able to find your way around the document. And I think it's important that you all be able to do that in this class and in general. So, this is on your note-taking sheet. Memorize these, remember these, right? What article corresponds with what, especially the first 3. I mean, the first 3 are just fundamental. You need to know, which articles correspond with which branches of government. That's huge. But just try and learn all of them. 27 amendments, these you don't need to memorize, right? Well, all I really want you to know is that the first 10 amendments were enacted all at once as a bundle in 1791, and we called them the Bill of Rights, okay? Just, to illustrate the point that we keep amending the Constitution over time, let's just go through a couple of the highlights, right? 13th Amendment, 1865, banned slavery, right? No more involuntary servitude. It had just recently caused some problems for us as a country in 1865. We decided maybe we'll try and preempt those in the future by banning. 14th Amendment, 1868. We've talked about the 14th Amendment, right, in Perry v. Schwarzenegger, right? That's my favorite amendment. But, it just illustrates, right, immediately after the Civil War, we enacted the 13th and 14th and also the 15th Amendment, which isn't up here. The 19th Amendment, several years later, in 1920, granting women the constitutionally protected right to vote. Right, just celebrated its 90th anniversary this summer, and then, fairly recently, in 1971, the 26th Amendment, promising 18-year-olds the right to vote. Right, we had a lot of 18-year-olds that were going over fighting and dying in Vietnam, and yet they had to wait till they were 21 in many states before they could vote. When they came back, a lot of people thought that was unfair, so we lowered the national voting age to 18. Right, and so the point here, right, is just understand that 1, the Constitution has been amended 27 times. 2, the first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. They were enacted in 1791. And 3, we keep amending the Constitution over time, right? Remember, Article 5 gives us the power to do it, and we keep doing it. We can see throughout history, 1791, 1865, 1868, 1920, 1971, right? It keeps happening, right? It's happened 27 times. That's the point that I want you to take away here, right? Now let's get into the real important part of this section, which is the 3 key principles. And the first principle is separation of powers, right? So, the definition is fairly clear to most of you at this point, right? It's basically just the division of legislative, executive, and judicial powers into these different sections of government. It's a way of ensuring that these different roles of government operate independently, right? And we see that we do this in different ways, right? We put them in different buildings, right? The Capitol, the White House, the Supreme Court, right? We put them in different rooms, right? The chambers, the legislative chambers, the Oval Office, the U.S. Supreme Court, right? They're held by different people. They can't be held by the same people at the same time, these different roles, right? So we look at the most recent, right? The 111th Congress, President Barack Obama, the Supreme Court last term, right? An example of separation of powers, because remember, the goal here is to be able to recognize these principles when you see them, not necessarily to be able to name them or define them off the top of your head. Here's an example, right? President Obama, before he was president, served in the Senate. He had to retire from the Senate. He had to resign his Senate seat, right, amid much controversy, in order to assume the presidency. right? That's a classic example of separation of powers, because you can't serve in two branches of government at the same time, right? The whole point is to prevent consolidation of power, right? So this is a good example of what that looks like. Let's move on to the second principle, which is closely related to the first, which is checks and balances, right? What is checks and balances? It's a system that gives each branch of government the authority to limit the powers of the other branches, right? So checks and balances, right, the second principle, is basically just a way of ensuring that the first principle functions, right? Making sure that separation of powers actually happens, right? Making sure that every branch of government stays in their corner and doesn't overpower the other branches. We have some examples of it here, right? The most famous, right, is probably the presidential veto, right? No bill that Congress passes can become a law unless the president signs it, right? If the president doesn't like it, he can veto it. If he vetoes it, and then Congress wants to pass it anyway, they can override his veto with a 2/3 majority, right? The next sheet, this diagram gives a bunch of great examples. You have it in your notes. I've given you the actual diagram. Again, you can go on and memorize these if it helps you learn them. I'm not going to be testing you on what each of the checks and balances are. I want you to be able to recognize them when you see it. That's the goal here, right? Not to be able to spout them off the top of your head, not to be able to give me the definition, but to recognize these principles when you see it, right? So this is a diagram that will hopefully help you do that. Study it at home. We're not going to go that much in depth over it now, right? The purpose of checks and balances, remember, is to prevent any one branch of government from overpowering the others, right? So here we have a comic from the Bush presidency. We can see President Bush and Vice President Cheney, right? They're cowboys, they're bandits, they're on horses, and they're dragging behind them, right, the Supreme Court building and the Capitol. And the idea is that in this case, the executive branch overpowered the other branches, right? This is referring to foreign policy during the Bush administration. The idea is that, at least what the cartoonist believes, is that checks and balances have failed. Congress has failed to appropriately check the president. The courts have failed to appropriately check the president. And as a result, the presidency, the executive branch, has overrun the other branches, right? That's what checks and balances is supposed to prevent, right? And now the third principle, right, my favorite principle, federalism, which again kind of has two definitions. The first definition is really talking about the relationship between these different levels of government, right? The federal government, the state governments, and the local governments, right? This is kind of like vertical federalism, right? The idea is that there's kind of a layer cake of government, right? So it's doing the same thing. It's dividing up power among different branches, among different levels of government, right? So separation of power divides powers up among different branches of government, the different things the government's doing. This is dividing them up among the different levels of government, right? The other definition of federalism refers to kind of the relationship between different the same level of government, right? So between state governments, for instance, or between city governments, right? We talked about how the purpose, right, of that, that kind of federalism is to create competition between different municipalities, between different states, right? The idea being that if different states are allowed to enact different laws, we can then kind of have these little laboratories of democracy, right? Certain states can do some things. If it works, other states can copy them. If it doesn't work, then other states know not to do that, right? Creating competition. And then, of course, dividing power, just like separation of powers. You all, again, just so you have an example of what it looks like. We talked about this example, right, which is how the federal government oftentimes wants to use and co-opt local police forces or state police forces to enforce immigration laws, right? So this is a question of federalism, right? And DT, I believe, mentioned how if the federal government wants to take over, local state police departments, it needs to do something in exchange. It can't just tell the states what to do because the states have their own independent powers, right? The federal government can't control the states. So you might have to give them money. You might have to give them money to their police forces in order to say, help us out with immigration enforcement, things like that, right? This is an example of federalism. This is an ongoing controversial example of federalism in action, right? What about the relationship between federalism as a principle and separation of powers? You all remember the magnificent diagram that we had to kind of document this relationship. It's on the front page of your note-taking sheet. I believe we called it the awesome federalism SOP diagram when we saw it the first time. I'm about to put it on the board right now so you can take a look at it. Before I do, just a quick warning. This diagram is much like our sun, brilliant, and looking directly at it with the naked eye can be harmful. So I encourage you all to kind of maybe glance at the periphery, maybe use the sheet on your notes, because this diagram is something truly special, right? You guys, Carly doesn't look. Are you ready, Carly?
I'm ready.
Carly's okay. Here we go. Here it is. Oh, okay, there it is. Okay, good, right. All right. So here it is. Here's the diagram, right? We know that Federalism is represented by the blue arrows, right? And we can see it's going in two directions, right? We have vertical federalism, right? That's the layer cake we talked about, the relationship between the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments, right? We also have federalism going on in between the constituent parts of government, right? So between government, state government A and state government B, between all these different local levels of government, the red arrows represent separation of powers, and we can see that that happens at every level of government, right? The federal government, we know, separates the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, but state governments often do the same thing, right? So do local governments, right? And so this is a kind of a panoramic view of federalism and separation of powers in action. This is a very important diagram. You should all learn it. This is why I've copied it and put it on your note-taking sheets. I know that you're all very tempted to take those note-taking sheets, to blow them up, to frame them, to put them on the ceiling above your bed so it's the first thing you see when you wake up and the last thing you see before you fall asleep. Maybe to sell them on eBay where they will no doubt fetch large sums of money. Before you do all that, use them to study. After Thursday, do whatever you want with the diagram. But remember, this is an important concept. I want you all to learn it. Use the sheets that you have. There will be questions on this relationship on your exam. Great. That's architecture of the document. Let's move on to section 3, student speech protections, right? This section, again, you guys